Hi everyone, I'm Taylor Hudak, co-founder of Action for Assange and an independent journalist. Right now I am at the National Press Club in DC for an event that was held by the Courage Foundation about the prosecution of Julian Assange and specifically the dangers associated with that and what we can expect if he is extradited and tried and convicted in the US. I'm joined by Julian Assange's attorney, Barry Pollack, so thank you so much for doing this interview.
Sure, Taylor.
For somebody who's maybe not so familiar with this case, why people should be very concerned, especially if you're a journalist?
Well, I think you should be very concerned if you're a journalist, because what this prosecution is doing is making it criminal to publish truthful information simply because the government considers that information to be classified information or national defense information. And journalists every day publish information that the government considers to be privileged. I think you should be very concerned about this prosecution if you're not a journalist, because what the First Amendment is about is it's not just about the right to publish, it's about our right to know. And what this prosecution is saying is when somebody has published truthful information that has told you what the United States government is doing, what it's doing in our name, that the government can come after that person criminally. And if they're allowed to do that, then obviously people aren't going to publish, and we're not going to know what the government is doing. These publications involve very newsworthy events and things that are very much in the public's interest to learn.
Why do you think the corporate media in America has failed to stand up for Julian Assange, one of their own essentially, because the outcome of his case could very well impact their work?
Well, I think that it may be a bit of an overstatement to say across the board that the corporate media is not standing up. I think that I personally have been disappointed that we haven't had more journalists speaking out more strongly, more loudly. But there have been journalists that have spoken out and spoken out consistently. David McGraw, who's the general counsel of the New York Times, has for years been talking about the threat to mainstream journalism that is caused by even the threat of prosecuting Assange, much less now that it's actually happened.
In fairness, the New York Times has been spreading misinformation, unfortunately.
Yeah, and again, like I say, it is a mixed bag. The New York Times, like any organization, is made up of any number of people, and there are reporters at the New York Times who I think have been better on this issue, and there are reporters at the New York Times who have been worse, and then you have people on the editorial board, so it's hard to paint with a broad brush. What I think is most significant is how is this conversation going to take place going forward? I do think that this indictment, charging a journalist with 17 counts of violating the Espionage Act, has been a wake-up call to a lot of mainstream journalists. And the panel tonight, where you had First Amendment experts speaking about the topic, they said that one thing that's going to be crucial going forward is how journalists report on the extradition and how they report on the prosecution if it happens. And I believe that over time, journalists will recognize that this is a threat to what they do, whether they're working for corporate media, working for independent media, that on this issue, they share an interest, and that is to push back on the idea that the government can make somebody subject to potentially life in prison for publishing truthful information.
Now, I know that another member in the audience did ask about the latest interpretation of the Constitution, the First Amendment, that the First Amendment does not apply to a foreign national. However, the Espionage Act of 1917 does. Do you agree with that interpretation?
No, absolutely not. What that was a reference to is the United States government, in the extradition proceedings in the UK, has tried to stake out the position that somehow the First Amendment doesn't apply to a foreign national. I don't think that will stand up in court here if the case ever gets here, nor should it, because as I said before, the First Amendment is not just about the publisher, it's about U.S. citizens. U.S. citizens are the ones who learned what the United States government was doing. For example, one of the publications included what's been called the collateral murder video, where U.S. troops gunned down a number of civilians, including two staffers for Reuters News. The world would never have learned about that. The United States citizens would never have learned about that if WikiLeaks hadn't published it. So the First Amendment protects us as citizens, and I think that a U.S. court will recognize that. Whether the speaker is an Australian citizen or an American citizen doesn't matter. What they're doing is they're publishing truthful information that is in the interest of U.S. citizens to know.
All right, and one last question here. One thing that very much concerns me and many people who care about human rights and see the clear violations that have been taking place in this case, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Nils Melzer, has officially reported since May, I believe, that Julian Assange has been subjected to torture while living in the Ecuadorian embassy and while he has been in Belmarsh prison. How does that play out in this case as well?
So there had been a finding by the UN that he was subjected to an unlawful detention in the embassy and under conditions that amounted to torture, and there has now been a finding that continues with respect to his conditions in Belmarsh prison. I certainly hope and expect that's something that the UK courts will take into account in deciding whether or not to extradite.
All right, Barry Pollack, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.